isolated events. A criminal can realistically target only one or two individuals at a time. Cybercrime, on the other hand, scales exponentially. A single hacker can target hundreds of victims simultaneously, paralyzing entire systems in a matter of hours. In the current Jamaican tourist industry, most resorts and hotels have fully transitioned to a completely cashless system. Everything from the room keys to dinner reservations and spa bookings is digital. When you digitalize everything, a cyber attack is no longer just a financial loss, it is an infrastructure collapse. We have already seen the devastating blueprint of this in Jamaica. Look at the recent cyber attack on Northern Caribbean University. The hack was so severe that the entire system was forced to a standstill. Financial records were compromised, online systems collapsed, and the institution was forced to retreat to a completely offline, archaic methods of operation. Now, transpose that reality onto a multi-million-dollar mega industry. If a ransomware attack strikes a major hotel chain or the airport logistics network, the system paralyzes overnight. Electronic room keys stop working, booking systems wipe out, and international banking gateways will immediately disconnect from Jamaican servers to prevent the spread of malware. Because Jamaica faces a severe tech brain drain, we do not have the immediate domestic infrastructure to fight back. Just this year, in 2026, the Upper House had to urgently revisit the Cybercrimes Act because the state realized we are legally and technologically defenseless against this rising tide. Thank you.
Am I being heard clearly? Okay, great. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1.
Now invite the first speaker from the opposition to begin.
Thank you. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Just on April 29, 2026, a Jamaican-born U.S. citizen from Queens, New York, named Melissa Somnott, came to celebrate her birthday with her husband, Dane Watson. She was later killed as a result of repeated blunt force trauma to her head and was pronounced dead at Parnell Regional Hospital, according to the Jamaica Gleaner. Wait, I'm not finished yet. Just days before, on April 12, 2026, at Carnival in Kingston, 39-year-old Jeremy Watson was struck by a stray bullet due to an altercation between entertainers. He's now in critical condition and may suffer permanent disability due to nerve damage, as reported by the Jamaica Observer. Ladies and gentlemen, these are just a few cases of violent crime threatening Jamaica's tourism industry as a major destination hub, placing the country's safety, security, travel advisories, economy, and reputation at risk. The stakes could not be higher. Tourism contributes approximately 1/3 of Jamaica's economy when both direct and indirect contributions are considered, supporting hundreds of thousands of jobs across the island. Any factor that undermines tourist confidence in Jamaica's safety, therefore, threatens entire communities and livelihoods. And side government is trying to convince the world with their highly preposterous reasoning that cybercrime has greater long-term impacts on the Jamaican tourism industry. Ladies and gentlemen, when we juxtapose these two crimes, we recognize that both can have long-term impacts on tourism. However, this debate is about the greater long-term threat. For that reason, the opposition firmly rejects the motion and maintains that violent crime poses the greater long-term threat to Jamaica's tourism industry. Honorable adjudicators and my fellow debaters, good day. I will now present the opposition's case. I will advance two arguments. First, violent crime creates greater harm to tourism because it directly threatens human life and safety. Second, cybercrime is more preventable and recoverable, making it less damaging in the long term. My second speaker will extend this by examining the perception of safety and reputational consequences of violent crime. And my third speaker will conduct a full comparative weighing of the debate and explain why the opposition must win. With that established, I must now move on to my first argument. Cybercrime is less threatening than violent crime. Cybercrime includes phishing, fraud, hacking, and identity theft, as highlighted in a UL lecture by Dr. Yannick Campbell on the Ministry of Tourism website. It can erode guest trust, damage revenue, and harm brand reputation. However, these consequences remain largely financial and technological in nature and centered around data, money, and systems. Violent crime, on the other hand, is fundamentally different. According to the Jamaica Information Service, it creates structural barriers to tourism growth, forces increased security spending, and most importantly, results in loss of life. This is the clear distinction. Cybercrime affects transactions and systems. Violent crime affects people. To understand why this matters, we must look at how tourists actually behave. When violent crime increases in our destination, booking numbers drop rapidly because travelers prioritize personal safety above everything else. In many cases, they do not simply avoid a hotel or attraction, they avoid the entire country. International tourism research consistently shows that safety and security are among the most influential factors in destination choice, meaning that once safety is questioned, tourism demand declines significantly. The long-term reputational damage is even more severe. Violent crime creates fear that spreads quickly international media and social platforms. And unlike financial losses, fear is extremely difficult to reverse. A cyber attack may damage a single hotel or tourism operator, but violent crime damages the perception of Jamaica as a whole, affecting the competitiveness of the entire tourism industry. It is clear that no tourist wants to experience cybercrime. However, most would still prefer it over violent crime. If Calvin Blackman had only suffered cybercrime, his financial losses could have been refunded, his account restored, and his identity protected. But because he was a victim of violent crime, none of those remedies matter. His life was lost. That is the difference between the two. We therefore conclude this argument by establishing that violent crime poses a greater existential threat to tourism because it destroys the foundation of the industry, perceived safety. Now on to my second substantive. Cybercrime is more preventable and recoverable. Moving to the second argument, cybercrime includes fraud, phishing, hacking, and scams. However, it is generally less threatening because it targets financial and digital systems rather than human life and physical safety. Unlike violent crime, cybercrime is preventable as mentioned before. Tourists can use two-factor authentication, avoid suspicious links, monitor accounts, and strengthen password security. It is also manageable as banks and institutions can freeze accounts, reverse transactions, and restore access. Most importantly, it is often recoverable, since financial losses can be reimbursed and systems can be repaired. In contrast, violent crime offers no equivalent recovery. A tourist who loses money may be compensated, but a tourist who experiences violence may carry psychological trauma for years and may disencourage others from traveling. The impact, therefore, extends beyond the individual and affects future travel decisions. Additionally, cybercrime is supported by strong legal and institutional frameworks such as the Cybercrime Act and Data Protection Act, which provide penalties and protections for both cybercrimes, citizens, and visitors, victims. Tourists are also given clear guidance on how to reduce risk, including resecuring digital footprints and monitoring financial activity. However, there is no comparable system that can predict or prevent violent crime. No alert can warn a tourist before a robbery, shooting, or assault occurs. While cybercrime can be actively managed and mitigated, violent crime remains unpredictable and irreversible. The question before this house is simple. Which crime poses the greater long-term threat to Jamaica's tourism industry? Throughout this debate, the opposition has demonstrated that violent crime directly threatens human life, creates immediate fear, damages international reputation, discourages travel, and undermines the foundation of tourism safety. With that being said, the opposition pauses.
Wonderful, excellent opening remarks. We will now invite our second speaker from St. Jago to join us at the podium, well, at the desk. But second speaker, please go ahead.
Are you hearing me?
Yes, we are. Please go ahead.
Before I begin my speech, I will start with the rebuttals. Said opposition, we're not saying that there won't be any violent crime done to the tourists. We are saying that the effects of cyber crimes have a greater impact on the tourism industry in Jamaica. Also, the examples of the tourists that you gave, they went out of the resort bubble that we're insisting is safe and is fairly safe. Finally, remember, violent crime and tourism has been coexisting for years, and yet tourists still come to Jamaica. I will now begin my speech. This match is not whether or not violent crimes have an impact on tourism. It is whether it poses a greater and longer impact on it compared to cyber crimes. And we have, and I will further prove why cyber crimes have the greater impact. Our first speaker showed that because violent crime affects locals and not so much, if any at all, tourists, the crime that directly affects the tourists is the one that has the most impact. Year after year, despite high crimes and travel advisories, Jamaica's tourism sector surpasses previous records. Crime, therefore, temporarily and in a very small way impact decisions to visit Jamaica. But cyber crimes are internal in impact. This brings me directly into my first essential point. Cyber crimes will permanently plague the tourism sector as long as businesses not accepted, as long as businesses continue to rely on digital platforms. The opposition is living in the olden days of paper logbooks. Today, the tourism sector reliance on digital platform is absolute and evolving, as over 100 hotels across the island digitalize their operations. Their digital attacks surface growth exponentially. Major chains like Grand Palladium don't even accept cash anymore. Furthermore, the integration of advanced AI-driven, not accepted AI-driven systems has created a complex digital ecosystem that is increasingly vulnerable to unprecedented threats. Cyber criminals are actively exploiting the massive volumes of sensitive data, including password details and credit card info processed daily. And judges, let us not limit our minds to external hackers. Insider threats from compromised employees within these hotels represent a massive unchecked vulnerability. Unlike a localized physical crime, which is limited to a specific street corner, cybercrime strikes at tourists before they arrive, during their stay, and long after they depart. It is an omnipresent, expanding threat directly undermining the industry's future stability. Please be reminded, said opposition, that violent crime mostly affects the locals. My second point strikes at the very metric of this debate. The duration of cybercrime's impact is structurally permanent, stretching far beyond 5 years, whereas violent crime is rapidly outgrown. The hospitality industry is now one of the most targeted sectors on earth, with not accepted, with 91% of travel organizations reporting data breaches each year. According to the IBM's cost of a data breach report, it takes a hospitality company an average of 212 days just to realize they have been hacked. No side opposition, cybercrime is not easily recoverable. When a central reservation database is breached, the fallout is catastrophic. Rebuilding shattered digital infrastructure, upgrading global payment gateways, and facing international regulatory fees cost an average of $3.36 million per incident. This creates a devastating economic disparity for Jamaica. Digital vulnerabilities attack the absolute requirements of international commerce, systemic financial trust. When hotel networks are compromised, the fear of identity theft causes an immediate 25% increase in customer churn because 83% of consumers flatly refuse to book with a breach ban for years. If Jamaica's resorts become identified with these digital fraud, global banking networks and credit card giants like Visa and MasterCard will blacklist Jamaican booking engines to protect themselves from liability. If an international tourist cannot safely use their credit card to book a room online where 80% of bookings don't happen, the reservation pipeline dries off completely. Adjudicator, let us look at, it's in the final minutes, let us look at the grand scale of this impact. Tourism drives over 30% of Jamaica's GDP and sustains 1/3 of our workforce. That is 175,000 direct and 354,000 indirect jobs. When the digital pipeline dries up and these thousands of ordinary Jamaicans are thrown into unemployment, what does the side opposition think they will do? Will they simply cease to exist? Or will economic desperation force them into a life of physical crime, directly fueling the very monster the opposition claims to be fighting? These impacts do not exist because of violent crimes. They are directly the result of cyber crimes. For these reasons, the choice is clear. I rest my case.
Miss, am I permitted to speak?
Thank you so much. We will now invite the second speaker from Munro College to begin. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you don't have to count yourself down. I know you watch Parliament. When our parliamentarians come into Parliament, you hear them counting. No, they don't. They get right into the punch. So please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Madam Speaker, I've never seen a group of brilliant minds look so desperately for trouble in all the wrong places in all my life. Need I remind side proposition that long-term is defined by the permanence of the damage. The first speaker of the proposition gave a highly academic, beautifully worded speech about digital transformation and the vulnerability of our point-of-sale systems. It was incredibly scholarly, yet completely detached from reality. They argued that cybercrime is ultimately long-term threat to tourism, but let us connect the dots they conveniently left out. When Booking.com reported a massive 900% spike in travel scams due to AI, did the world stop traveling? No. Jamaica went right ahead and welcomed over 4.5 million visitors, generating a 4.2 billion in revenue. Hence my profound disdain of the moon. Violent crime, Madam Speaker, remains the single greatest existential threat to Jamaican tourism. To understand why, we must look past these past balance sheets and delve directly into the primal psychology of the global traveler. Tourism is the commercialization of an illusion, the purchase of a temporary sanctuary of absolute peace. Therefore, the primary currency of tourism is not money, it is the psychological serenity. Human beings are hardwired biologically to prioritize physical survival over digital data. As cybercrime targets a consumer's stored label, rather, their credit card details or loyal points, violent crime targets their limbs and lives. If a traveler experiences a digital breach, no, not at this time. The response is localized anxiety. It is an administrative nuisance. They call their banks, freeze their cards, and still board the flight. Why? Because money is replaceable. But violent crime produces visceral terror. A tourist can simply sip a complimentary rum punch on the beaches of Negril, while their credit card is being frozen due to an international data hack. They cannot enjoy that same luxury if they are actively scanning the tree line for a gunman. The traveler's tolerance for digital risk is exceptionally high for the sake of modern convenience, but their tolerance for physical violence is absolute zero. Furthermore, Madam Speaker, the nature of crime culpability in the global media landscape is heavily asymmetrical. When a cybercrime incident hits a hospitality brand, the media does not indict the soil upon which the hotel stands. The global headline reads, Marriott suffers data breach. The culpability is corporate and detached from geography. The consumer does not look at a map of Jamaica and say the dirt of that island is digitally toxic. No, they blame the international software provider. However, when violent crime hits, the indictment is exclusively sovereign. The headline reads, Violent flares in Jamaica, travel advisories issued. A level 3 travel advisory from the US Department of State doesn't say avoid Jamaican Wi-Fi. It says reconsider travel. This linguistic shift instantly triggers corporate travel bans, invalidates consumer travel insurance, and forces commercial airlines to recalibrate their routes. Cybercrime impacts a specific corporation's liability. Violent crime devalues the entire sovereign brand of our nation. This brings us to the brutal economic reality of market substitutability rather. Cybercrime is globally ubiquitous. It happens with the exact same ruthless frequency in Miami, London, Cancun, and Punta Cana. A tourist cannot substitute Jamaica for another destination to lower their digital risk because changing geographic coordinates does not lower digital exposure. It does not alter destination market share. Violent crime, however, is intensely localized. If a traveler perceives our corridors as physically unsafe, the psychological substitution is immediate. They do not cancel their vacation, they simply shift their capital. They route their families away from Montego Bay and land them instead into the Cayman Islands or Aruba. Cybercrime keeps the tourists in the hotel room complaining about Wi-Fi. Violent crime empties the hotel entirely. Ultimately, consider the structural distortion violent crime inflicts upon our national budget. When an enterprise faces a cybercrime attack, the remediation is ring-fenced within the private sector using private capital. The national budget remains entirely unmolested. Violent crime conversely forces the Jamaican state to structurally pervert its public expenditure instead of investing aggressively into our target of 8 million visitors by 2030, or expanding the local first initiative to uplift local businesses. The state is forced to redirect billions of dollars away from infrastructure and marketing, swallowing it into national security, militarized policing, and persistent state of public emergency. Mr. Speaker, let us not be blinded by the misaligned arguments of the proposition. Cybercrime is a challenge of modern convenience. Manageable through software and encryption, violent crime is a challenge of societal survival. If we lose the battle against violence in our streets, it won't matter how secure our servers are, because our hotel rooms will be completely empty. The ultimate long-term threat to the jewel of the Caribbean is not hacker in the dark, but the breakdown of peace on our shores. Let us take keen consideration of this. As technology advances, you cannot expect that only the risks become pervasive, as so does the solvencies. It is for this the opposition rests momentarily.
Thank you very much, Munro College. Judges, how are you? Are you getting your scores? Should we invite the third speaker in now?
Yes, you may proceed.
Okay, third speaker. St. Jago College. You may begin.
The tourism sector's dependence on digital platforms will continue to expose it to cybercrime risk as the platform develops. As hotels digitize their operations and rely on interconnected systems, their attack surface grows, making cybersecurity more critical and challenging as ever. The industry's high volume of sensitive data, including personal identification details and credit card information, makes it an attractive target for cybercriminals. The integration of AI-driven systems also creates a complex digital ecosystem that's vulnerability to cyber threats grows rapidly. The impact of cybercrime is significant and long-lasting on Jamaica's tourism industry. Unlike violent crime, which is limited to specific locations or incidents, cybercrime can affect tourists before, during, and after their visit. Tourists, on the other hand, feel secure staying within the resort zones. The hotels that tourists stay at are typically well protected. Cybercrime breaches that bubble of safety. Tourists' financial data, passport information, and identity can be stolen while booking and even staying at the resort, destroying the fundamental sense of psychological safety. Tourism travel safety and other physical safety are unaffected for tourists. Their cybersecurity is jeopardized, especially since there can be many victims at a time, and data can be pulled off in a matter of hours, while the duration of exposure can last up to 206 days or more after being detected. The financial setback from a single week of total digital blackouts, unbooked rooms, grounded flights, and systemic business interruption would cost the Jamaican economy millions of dollars, eventually resulting in years of economic standstill. A major ransomware attack targeting Jamaica's major resort clusters or airport logistics causes a total system crash. A cybercriminal can use a phishing attack or data scrape to steal all the credit card details, passport information, and home address, proving especially problematic if the cybercriminal is a hotel cashier. The effects of cybercrime can cause tourists to lose interest in traveling to the country, resulting in a major plummet in tourism growth and economic income. The duration of its impact is structurally permanent, whereas the impact of violent crimes is impermanent and rapidly contained. When evaluating a long-term threat, which has an impact extending 5 years or more, the metric of victory not accepted is not the initial shock of the value of an incident, but the speed of industry recovery. The difference in duration creates a catastrophic economic disparity for Jamaica. Digital vulnerabilities are globally infectious. A rise in cybercrime attacks is the absolute prerequisite of international commerce. In conclusion, cybercrimes have a greater long-term effect on tourists, which subsequently ends up affecting tourism rather than violent crimes. Cybercrime in tourism results in a loss of private information, money, and livelihood, as the uses of the digital space is now a part of everything that we do, while violent crimes are isolated cases that require the offender to gain access to one or two persons, making it harder to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we will now move over to our third and final speaker from Munro College. Please go ahead.
Fire there must feel. Him think a cool breeze. That is exactly what the proposition is doing. They're treating a raging fire like a gentle wind. They want this house to believe that because tourism is becoming more digital, cybercrime will somehow overtake violent crime as a primary threat to Jamaica's tourism. That argument rests on false assumption. The proposition told us earlier about hacked servers or lost data. But note this, judges. A hacked system can be restored. A human life lost can never be regained. That brings us to the core of this debate, comparative weighing. We must weigh a threat that is technical and preventable against a threat that is physical and fatal. Tourists do not sit at airports worrying about encrypted databases or at a temporary booking outage. They worry about their physical safety. The United States State Department explicitly warns travelers in its latest advisory that despite improvements, and I quote, violent crime is a risk throughout Jamaica, and armed robberies and sexual assaults are common. Let us look at the anatomy of Jamaica tourism. The proposition has spent this entire debate inside a single hotel server room. Let us be real. Tourists do not come to Jamaica for hotels. They come here for brand Jamaica. According to the Jamaica Tourist Board, around 30 to 40% of the revenue generated comes from hotel bookings. But the government fails to look at the other 60% of our multi-million-dollar tourism economy. A cybercrime cannot hack a craft vendor in Ocho Rios. A ransomware attack cannot lock a local farmer selling produce through our agri-linkage exchange. And a software bug cannot paralyze a $7 billion Carnival Street parade. But you know what can? Violent crime. Think about that language. That is the barrier to our tourism. Tourism contributes over 30% of our GDP, supporting thousands of local lives. What keeps our international stakeholders awake at night is not cyber threats, which affect every single nation globally, as aforementioned by my second speaker, but the localized, targeted stigma of violent crime that damages brand Jamaica specifically. Jamaica's own Minister of Tourism, Edmund Bartlett, notes that the bedrock of our industry is destination assurance. The promise that a visitor will be safe and secure. When physical fear rises, that assurance is shattered and tourists will find shelter in other destinations. That fear is driven by violent crime, not cybersecurity. The proposition is defining cybercrime by worst-case sci-fi scenarios. Given that Jamaicans' actual cyber threat reports show that a vast majority of local cybercrimes are simply phishing and online fraud, How does a digital scam present a greater existential threat to tourism than the literal loss of life, human life? Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, judges, timekeeper, it is with these and other facts why we must stand against this motion. We wholeheartedly reject this motion. The position passes.
And pause indeed. What fiery remarks we had by both teams. And just to remind those that may be watching us on YouTube and on Zoom, the motion for today is this House believes that the rise in cybercrimes poses a greater long-term threat to Jamaica's tourism industry than violent crimes. The teams will now prepare their rebuttals, and when we return, we will begin with the proposing team. And so, teams, you only have about 2 minutes, right? We don't want any long haul. I see a lot of smiles coming from Munro. So please get busy, sirs. And St. Jago, remember you are to write your rebuttal, okay? Judges, you may use the time to just tally the scores that you have thus far. Mr. Watt, you have been quiet. I'm not seeing you. Judge Watt, Gavay, you're with us?
I'm here, man. I'm here.
You're here. Okay, then. I'd like to use this opportunity to thank the Jamaica Hotel and Tourism Association that's online with us on YouTube. Minister Bartlett is also traveling in New York, and he also has the YouTube link for the match. Royalton Luxury Resorts, Madam Chair, Mrs. Carrie Ann Quilla Castle, who is also online. Beaches Negril, Moon Palace Jamaica, and Pair One, who has the Best Speaker trophy. So our sponsors are definitely in tune, and they are Okay, we have a minute to go. The judges are ready. Teams, are you ready? By the way, Tafari and Gabe, are you ready as well?
Yes, yes, I am.
Not yet. Miss.
All right. Shannara, can you spotlight Munro College? We're going to begin with Munro College. Okay, welcome back. The gentleman with the smiles.
Okay.
If you're just joining us, it's match 1 of the National Tourism Debate. We have St. Jago High and Munro College. And the motion is this House believes that the rise in cybercrimes poses a greater long-term threat to Jamaica's tourism industry than violent crime. We have with us Attorney at Law Malik Kelia, Chief Judge Tafari Hilton, businessman, and Gave Watt, who is representing the Jamaica Observer. We will now begin with our proposing team, Munro College, for the rebuttal section.
Correction, opposition teams.
Proposition.
Proceed, Munro.
The opposition is here to make one thing clear, that this motion has definitely proved the inefficacy that side proposition is yet to prove, that violent crimes are greater long-term threats to Jamaica tourism industry than cybercrime. The Deputy Prime Minister stated that they aren't debating that violent crime poses greater threat than cybercrime. However, the motion stated that we're explicitly debating greater long-term threats with cybercrime versus violent crime. The Deputy Prime Minister also mentioned that violent crime mostly happens to locals, but it is critical to understand the crime happens in Jamaica is synonymous to the country's travel advisory and reputation. So the crime doesn't necessarily have to impact tourists for them to decline coming to Jamaica. Media alone is sufficient to disclose what's happening in Jamaica. My deputy leader of opposition argued in defense to make known the diversion of tourist population to other tourism industries in a keen example of perception safety. So celebrating 4.1 million visitors